It was the kind of small-town diner where regulars didn't need menus, and the waitresses called every man Han, with the easy familiarity of someone who had lived in the same zip code for decades. Mornings there were busy, a jumble of coffee refills, sizzling bacon, and murmured conversations about Little League games and church fundraisers. That Thursday morning, however, was different. The moment he walked in, the hum of conversation quieted ever so slightly. Not enough to be rude, but enough that anyone paying attention would have noticed. He was dressed in a tailored gray suit, the kind that looked out of place among the flannel shirts and work boots that dominated the diner. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, clicked against the tiled floor as he made his way to an empty booth in the corner. Everything about him screamed outsider, from his stiff posture to the way he carefully adjusted his cufflinks before sitting down. Yet, there was no arrogance in his demeanor, no haughty expression or dismissive glance. If anything, he seemed tired, bone-tired in a way that even a strong cup of coffee couldn't fix. Darlene, the head waitress, approached him with the same cheerful smile she gave everyone, but she couldn't help the flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Outsiders were rare in Willow Creek, especially ones who looked like they belonged on the cover of a business magazine. The man didn't look up when she placed a mug of coffee in front of him. He simply nodded his thanks and stared out the window. The diner's regulars soon resumed their conversations, though more than a few pairs of eyes drifted back to the man in the gray suit. He sipped his coffee slowly, his gaze fixed on the street outside. It was almost as if he were waiting for something, or someone, but no one came. After a while, he stood, left a $20 bill on the table for a $3 coffee, and walked out without a word. By the time the lunch rush began, the man in the gray suit had been largely forgotten, his brief appearance reduced to a footnote in the town's daily routine. But then he came back the next day, and the day after that, always at the same time, always sitting at the same booth, always leaving far more money than necessary. People started to notice. Speculation ran rampant. Some thought he was a real estate developer scouting land for a new project. Others guessed he was a lawyer or a private investigator. A few even whispered about witness protection or FBI surveillance. But no one dared to approach him directly, not even Darlene, who prided herself on knowing everyone's business. As the days turned into weeks, his presence became a fixture of the diner's morning routine. He never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his answers were brief and polite. He never complained, never caused a scene, and never lingered longer than an hour. Yet, despite his quiet demeanor, there was something about him that unsettled people. It wasn't just his expensive suit or his aloof manner. It was the sense that he was waiting for something. Then, one morning, he did something different. He walked in carrying a small, battered suitcase. The edges were frayed, and the leather handle was cracked from years of use. He placed it on the seat beside him and ordered his usual coffee, but this time he didn't stare out the window. Instead, he opened the suitcase. The sight of its contents sent a ripple of unease through the diner. It wasn't money or documents or anything overtly suspicious. It was a collection of small, seemingly random items. A worn leather wallet, a silver pocket watch, a stack of faded Polaroids, and a crumpled piece of paper that looked like it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. The man took out the wallet first, turning it over in his hands as if trying to decipher a secret hidden in the scuffs and scratches. Then he moved on to the pocket watch, polishing its surface with a handkerchief he pulled from his jacket pocket. The Polaroids came next, dozens of them, each one studied carefully before being set aside. Finally, he unfolded the piece of paper, smoothing it out on the table with painstaking care. No one could see what was written on it, but the expression on his face was enough to send a shiver down Darlene's spine. It wasn't grief, exactly, or even regret. It was something deeper, something that seemed to pull him further and further into himself with each passing second. By the time he finished his coffee, the suitcase was packed up again, and the man in the gray suit was gone. But the questions he left behind lingered. Who was he? What was he looking for? And why did he seem so haunted by a collection of old, ordinary objects? For a town like Willow Creek, where secrets were rare and life moved at a predictable pace, the man in the gray suit was more than an oddity. He was a mystery. And mysteries, as everyone knew, had a way of unraveling everything around them. The first crack appeared the next day, when Darlene found a Polaroid tucked under the coffee mug he had left behind. It was a picture of a house, white with green shutters and a wraparound porch. She didn't recognize it, but something about it felt familiar, like a word on the tip of her tongue. She showed it to the other waitresses, but no one could place it. That night, Darlene went home with the Polaroid tucked into her apron pocket, her mind buzzing with possibilities. She had no idea that by the time the man in the gray suit returned, the quiet rhythm of life in Willow Creek would already be unraveling. Darlene couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph was important. There was something in the way it seemed worn, as if it had been handled more times than she could count. The corners were soft, the colors faded, and yet the image still held a strange kind of vitality. The house looked ordinary enough, modest and welcoming, the kind of place where someone might sit on the porch with a glass of lemonade in the summer. But the more she stared at it, the more she felt a gnawing sense of familiarity that she couldn't quite place. That evening, after her shift at the diner, Darlene sat at her kitchen table with the photograph laid out in front of her. She studied every detail, the chipped paint on the shutters, the flower beds framing the porch, even the faint silhouette of someone standing in the doorway, just barely visible in the background. She couldn't make out who it was, but the shadowy figure seemed frozen in time, waiting for her to notice something she wasn't yet ready to see. The next morning, Darlene brought the photograph back to the diner. She showed it to Gus, the cook, and to the other waitresses, but no one recognized the house. Some shrugged and said it looked like a dozen others scattered across the county. Others squinted at it for a moment before shaking their heads. The regulars at the counter chimed in too, offering their own theories. Maybe it was from another town, or maybe it was long gone, torn down or abandoned years ago. But there was one person Darlene hadn't shown the photo to, the man in the gray suit. When he walked in at his usual time, carrying his battered suitcase, Darlene felt a sudden rush of nervous energy. Should she ask him about it? Would he be angry that she'd kept something he'd left behind? Or worse, would he leave and never come back, taking his secrets with him? In the end, she did nothing. She poured his coffee and refilled it when it got low, just as she always did. The photograph stayed tucked in her apron pocket, burning against her leg like a secret she wasn't ready to share. The man went through his usual routine, unpacking his suitcase, examining each item with the same quiet intensity, and then packing it all up again before leaving far more money than necessary on the table. But this time, when he stood to go, he hesitated. Darlene froze, her hand gripping the coffee pot. For the first time since he'd started coming to the diner, the man in the gray suit looked directly at her. It wasn't just a passing glance, either. It was a deliberate, searching look, as if he were trying to gauge whether she knew something she shouldn't. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly, and walked out the door. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Darlene couldn't stop replaying the moment in her mind, wondering what it meant. Had he seen the photograph? Had he somehow known that she'd kept it? The questions churned in her head, each one more unsettling than the last. The next morning, he didn't come in. At first, Darlene told herself it was nothing. People missed their routines all the time. Maybe he'd gotten sick, or maybe he decided to move on to the next town. But as the hours ticked by, a sense of unease settled over the diner. The regulars noticed it too. They didn't say anything outright, but their glances toward the empty booth in the corner said enough. By the time her shift ended, Darlene couldn't stand it any longer. She grabbed her coat and the photograph and headed out to the only place she could think of, the library. Willow Creek's library was small, with creaky wooden floors and a librarian who seemed to know everything about everyone. If there was a record of the house in the photograph, Darlene figured this was the place to find it. She showed the picture to Miss Templeton, the librarian, who peered at it through thick glasses. "Looks like one of the old farmhouses out past the river," she said. "Might be in the archives. Follow me." The archives were housed in a dimly lit basement that smelled faintly of mildew and old paper. Miss Templeton led Darlene to a set of file cabinets and pulled open a drawer labeled Property Records, 1950 to 1980. "You'll want to start here," she said, handing Darlene a stack of yellowed folders. "If it's in town, it'll be in these." Darlene spent hours combing through the records, her fingers growing numb from flipping through pages. Just as she was about to give up, she found it. The house in the photograph had belonged to a man named Henry Dempsey. The record listed him as the owner from 1963 until 1979, when the property was sold to a developer. The house had been torn down a few years later, replaced by a strip mall that now housed a discount store and a laundromat. But it wasn't the fate of the house that caught Darlene's attention. It was what she found in an old newspaper article tucked inside the folder. The headline read, "Local Man Vanishes After Family Tragedy." According to the article, Henry Dempsey had been a quiet, unassuming man who lived alone in the house after his wife and daughter died in a car accident. One day, he simply disappeared. Neighbors noticed the house sitting empty, the yard overgrown, the mail piling up. Eventually, the authorities searched the property but found no trace of him. The case was never solved. Darlene stared at the article, her heart pounding. Was the man in the gray suit connected to Henry Dempsey? Had he been coming to Willow Creek to unravel a mystery from his own past? The questions came faster than she could process them, but one thing was clear. She had to find him. That night, Darlene stayed up late, staring at the photograph and rereading the article until her eyes ached. She didn't know what she was hoping to find, but she knew she couldn't let it go. Because somewhere out there, the man in the gray suit was waiting. For what? She didn't know. But she was certain of one thing. He wasn't done with Willow Creek. The next day, Darlene arrived at the diner with the photograph and the article folded neatly in her purse. She hoped the man in the gray suit would return, that he would slide into his usual booth and unpack his suitcase as if nothing had changed. But the morning passed, and then the afternoon, and the booth remained empty. By the time the lunch rush began, Darlene had convinced herself that he was gone for good. Maybe he had found what he was looking for, or maybe he had given up. Either way, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed her chance to understand him, to understand why he had come to Willow Creek and why he seemed so haunted by a collection of old, ordinary objects. But then, just as the afternoon lull set in, he walked through the door. He wasn't carrying his suitcase this time, and there was something different about him. His suit was still immaculate, his shoes still polished, but his posture was more rigid, his expression more guarded. He didn't go to his usual booth. Instead, he approached the counter, where Darlene was refilling the coffee pots. For a moment, she froze, unsure of what to say or do. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the photograph. "I think this belongs to you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The man's eyes flicked to the photograph, and something in his expression shifted. It wasn't surprise or anger. It was something closer to resignation, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. He took the photograph from her without a word and studied it for a long time. His face remained impassive, but Darlene could see the tension in his jaw, the faint tremor in his hands. Finally, he looked up at her and nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked out of the diner, leaving Darlene with more questions than answers. That night, she couldn't sleep. The image of the man's face as he looked at the photograph kept replaying in her mind, along with the headline from the article, "Local Man Vanishes After Family Tragedy." The next morning, she made a decision. She would go to the site where the house had once stood. If the man in the gray suit was connected to Henry Dempsey, then maybe the answer to his mystery was there, buried beneath the asphalt of the strip mall parking lot. The drive out to the edge of town was short, but it felt like an eternity. The strip mall was as ordinary as they came. A row of nondescript storefronts with faded signs and cracked pavement. Darlene parked near the laundromat and got out, clutching the photograph and the article in her hand. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. The house was long gone, and the land it had stood on had been paved over years ago. But as she walked across the parking lot, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She stopped in the middle of the lot, staring at the spot where the house had likely stood. For a moment, she imagined it as it had been in the photograph. The white siding, the green shutters, the wraparound porch. She could almost hear the creak of the porch swing, almost see the shadowy figure in the doorway. Then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like the clicking of polished shoes against pavement. She turned, and there he was. The man in the gray suit stood at the edge of the parking lot, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched her, his eyes following her every step as she walked toward him. When she reached him, he held out his hand. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure of what he wanted. Then she realized he was asking for the article. She handed it to him, and he unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the words as if seeing them for the first time. When he finished reading, he folded it again and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he turned and began walking away. "Wait," Darlene called after him. "Who are you?" He stopped but didn't turn around. For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, without looking back, he raised his hand and pointed to the strip mall behind her. Darlene turned, following his gaze to a patch of overgrown grass at the edge of the parking lot. It was a small, unremarkable strip of land, bordered by a chain-link fence. But as she looked closer, she noticed something odd. A weathered stone marker, half hidden beneath the grass. She walked over to it, her heart pounding. The stone was cracked and covered in moss, but the engraving was still legible. "In memory of Evelyn and Clara Dempsey." Darlene felt a chill run down her spine. The names matched the article, Henry Dempsey's wife and daughter. This must have been where the house had stood, and the marker must have been placed here after their deaths. She turned back to look for the man in the gray suit, but he was gone. Darlene knelt beside the marker, running her fingers over the engraved letters. She thought about the man in the gray suit and the items in his suitcase, the wallet, the pocket watch, the Polaroids. They weren't random objects. They were pieces of a life that had been lost. For the first time, she understood why he had come to Willow Creek. He wasn't just looking for answers. He was looking for closure. Darlene stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. She didn't know if the man in the gray suit would ever return, but she knew one thing for certain. His story wasn't finished yet. The discovery of the marker haunted Darlene long after she left the strip mall. She kept thinking about the man in the gray suit, his quiet intensity, his ritualistic unpacking of the suitcase, and the weight he carried with him, as if every step he took was laden with ghosts. Now, she understood why. The wallet, the pocket watch, the faded Polaroids, they were pieces of a family that no longer existed. But there was one piece of the puzzle she couldn't figure out. If the marker was for Henry Dempsey's wife and daughter, why did the article say that Henry himself had vanished? Where had he gone? And how did the man in the gray suit fit into all of it? 2 days passed, and the man didn't return to the diner. Darlene found herself scanning the parking lot whenever she drove past the strip mall, half hoping and half dreading that she might see him. But he was gone, as suddenly and mysteriously as he had appeared. On the third day, an envelope arrived at the diner. It was addressed to Darlene, with no return address. The handwriting was neat and precise, and the paper felt expensive, like something from an old stationery set. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a smaller envelope. The note read, "Some stories are too heavy to tell, but you deserve to know. Thank you for your kindness. You helped more than you realize." The smaller envelope contained a key and an address. It wasn't an address she recognized, but it wasn't far, just outside of town, past the old grain silo that hadn't been used in years. Darlene finished her shift early that day, unable to focus on anything but the mystery in her hands. She drove out to the address, the key jingling in her pocket like a constant reminder of the strange turn her life had taken. The address led her to a small, weathered storage facility. The units were old and rusting, with faded numbers painted on the doors. She parked her car and walked to the unit that matched the number written on the envelope. The key fit perfectly, and with a deep breath, she pulled the door open. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of dust and oil. The space was small, no bigger than a single car garage, and it was filled with carefully arranged items. A wooden rocking chair sat in one corner, along with a small table holding a lamp and a stack of books. Against the back wall, there was a set of shelves lined with boxes, each labeled in the same precise handwriting that had been on the envelope. Darlene stepped inside, her heart pounding. She opened one of the boxes and found it full of photographs. They were all of the same family, the Dempseys. There were pictures of a smiling woman with dark hair, a little girl with curly pigtails, and a man who looked startlingly familiar. It was the man in the gray suit. Darlene sank into the rocking chair, her legs shaking. The man wasn't just connected to Henry Dempsey. He was Henry Dempsey. Or at least, he had been. But how? Why had he disappeared? Why had he returned now, after all these years? She found her answer in the bottom of the box. There was another envelope, thicker than the first, and inside it was a stack of handwritten letters. They were dated over several years, all addressed to Evelyn and Clara Dempsey, and all written by Henry. The letters told a story that was almost too painful to read. After his wife and daughter died, Henry had spiraled into grief. He couldn't bear to stay in the house, surrounded by reminders of what he had lost. One day, he packed a suitcase, walked out the door, and never looked back. He spent decades wandering from town to town, carrying with him only the things that reminded him of Evelyn and Clara. Their wallet, their watch, their photographs. But grief, Henry wrote, wasn't something you could outrun. No matter how far he traveled, it stayed with him, growing heavier with each passing year. He had come to Willow Creek not to find answers, but to lay the burden down. The Polaroid he had left in the diner had been a message, a quiet request for help from someone who could look at the pieces of his past with fresh eyes. The final letter in the stack was addressed to Darlene. You were the first person to see me, really see me, in decades. You reminded me that kindness still exists, even for those who feel they don't deserve it. I don't know what I'll find when I leave this place, but I know that it's time for me to go. Thank you for helping me take the first step. Darlene read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. She could picture him so clearly. The man in the gray suit, sitting in his booth, turning over the objects in his suitcase as if trying to piece together a life that had slipped through his fingers. For a long time, she sat in the storage unit, surrounded by the remnants of Henry Dempsey's life. She thought about the weight he had carried for so many years and the courage it must have taken to finally let it go. When she finally locked the unit and drove away, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. She didn't know where Henry was or if she would ever see him again, but she hoped he had found peace. Back at the diner, the booth in the corner remained empty, but every time Darlene walked past it, she thought of the man in the gray suit and the quiet way he had changed her life. And somewhere out there, Henry Dempsey was walking into the next chapter of his story, leaving behind the weight of the past and carrying only the hope of what lay ahead.